are these people?
So, Collin is mentioning this plea deal about Julian Assange, everyone's favorite publisher and, truth teller. But we'll get into who this lady is in a second. I'm sure people in the chat know her very well already, but if you're new, you'll find out. So this is from Scheerpost. The old Joe Lauria,
Joe.
he's out here, Consortium News favorite. This time putting some stuff in Scheerpost. So he writes, the U.S. ambassador. Well, I should go back to the title, huh? Carolyn Kennedy says U.S. open to Assange plea deal. So this was August 15th, not that long ago. The U.S. ambassador to Australia believes a plea bargain could free imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, allowing him to serve a shortened sentence for a lesser crime in his home country. Carolyn Kennedy told the Sydney Morning Herald in a front-page interview published Monday that the decision on a plea deal was up to the U.S. Justice Department, so it's not really a diplomatic issue, she says. Right off the bat, we're fucking big swings and misses to me.
Right.
But I think that there absolutely could be a resolution, she told the newspaper. And I think this is only because of public support for Assange has grown in Australia.
Right.
Right. Kennedy noted the firm comments by U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on July 31st in Brisbane that Mr. Assange was charged with very serious criminal conduct in the United States in connection with his alleged role in one of the later compromises of classified information. Where was I? Oh, compromises of classified information in the history of our country. So I say that only because, just as we understand sensitivities here, it's important that our friends understand sensitivities in the United States. Ugh. Like, what? Like, that's what that sounds like.
Right. Very serious criminal. Can you care to say what it was?
Huh? Like, no, he told the truth about us. That's what happened.
Right.
He said what we didn't want him to say to people. Despite Blinken's strong words, Kennedy said, but there is a way to resolve it. You can read the newspapers just like I can. I wouldn't read those newspapers, actually. Just saying.
Right.
Gabriel Shipton, Assange's brother, told the Herald Carolyn Kennedy wouldn't be saying these things if they didn't want a way out. The Americans want this off their plate. Right? Do they? Or do they want it handled?
I would argue the latter.
Yeah.
Make this go away.
Make this go away, please. Which we'll get to how that might happen. The newspaper said there could be a David Hicks style plea bargain. Collin, do you know that man? You heard of this guy? David Hicks?
No.
Cool, we'll get to him. A so-called Alford plea in which Assange would continue to state his innocence while accepting a lesser charge that would allow him to serve additional time in Australia. The 4 years Assange has already served on remand at London's maximum security Belmarsh prison could perhaps be taken into account. So this is saying that they're saying that this could happen. Doesn't mean that it does. If it does, we have this. So David Hicks, an Australian, violated his rights by jailing him after Guantanamo transfer. Okay? So comes out of Guantanamo. Okay? Goes to Australia. Okay, the same kind of deal, right? So David Hicks was arrested in Afghanistan in 2001, sent to the U.S. Naval Base at Gitmo in January 2002. In March 2007, after pleading guilty under a plea agreement, okay,
right,
he was, they tried to state earlier that he could plea innocence but just take a lesser charge. That's not how it works. That's not how plea deals work. Riddle me that.
Right. Typically, a plea deal, you give information that you want in exchange. So what are
Right.
you exchanging?
Right. What information
Nothing.
do you want him to give? What you know what I'm saying? That's
He gave
part of it. Well, the thing
the
is, I
information
think
you gave was the problem.
I think they're looking for reds. I think they're saying, look, take a bleed deal, give up your Russian sources, quote unquote. You know what I mean?
Ah, true.
Like,
True.
or any source.
Right.
Pick a source. I'm sure there's plenty of sources Assange has that they don't know about. You know?
Right.
So he may not be willing to do that to accept that plea. So he was convinced under the U.S. Military Commission Act of 2006 with, quote, providing material support for terrorism and given a 7-year sentence. Most of it suspended, right? That was the plea deal. We'll suspend most of it, okay? Acceptance of the plea agreement was a condition for his return. He was transferred in May 2007 to Australia, where he served the remaining 7 months of his sentence in prison, okay? By the time Mr. Hicks was transferred, there was a lot of information available that raised serious concerns about the fairness of the procedures by the U.S. Military Commission that should have been enough to cast doubt among the Australian authorities as to the legality and legitimacy of the sentence imposed on him. So Mr. Salvioli, Australian officials had also visited Mr. Hicks at Gitmo and were therefore in a good position to understand the conditions under which he was held and tried. However, Australia did not do so, and by accepting to imprison Mr. Hicks for the remainder of the sentence, Australia violated his rights under Article 9 of the Covenant, the committee found. As a party to the ICCPR, Australia is obliged to make full reparations to individuals whose rights have been violated. In Mr. Hicks's case, Australia's actions regarding the transfer arrangement were intended to help him and did, in fact, mitigate the harm he would have suffered had he remained in U.S. custody, and so the finding of a violation was sufficient reparations, the committee noted. What committee, Collin, do you think said all this and then eventually just went, it's whatever? Which committee do you think that is?
Jesus Christ.
These committees. Okay? So, we get back to Scheerpost. David Hicks was an Australian imprisoned by the United States in Gitmo for 5 years. He was ultimately released by the U.S. after pressure from the Australian government when he agreed to an Alford plea, in which he pled guilty to a single charge, but was allowed to assert his innocence at the same time on the grounds that he understood he would not receive a fair trial. Okay? So, it's essentially saying, plead guilty, say you're innocent. Right? So, Hicks was then returned to Australia where he served an additional 7 months in prison. His case was then thrown out on appeal when it was established that the charge of giving material assistance to terrorists was not yet a crime on the books at the time of his arrest. Okay? Which they distinctly left out of that last article. The Herald quoted Don Rothwell, an international law expert at Australian National University in Canberra, as saying that Assange would have to travel to the U.S. in order to work out the plea deal. So, that means what, Collin? He's got to come over here. What does that mean?
Not good.
That's extradition. That's what that is.
Right.
That means we'll just round you up, put you in jail anyway, and screw whatever plea deal we were going to offer you. So, everything that we know about Julian Assange suggests this would be a significant sticking point for him, Rothwell said. It's not possible to strike a plea deal outside the relevant jurisdiction, except in the most exceptional circumstances. However, Bruce Afrin, a U.S. constitutional attorney, told Consortium News CN Live webcast in May that it would indeed be possible for Assange to remain in Britain to work out the deal. Usually, American courts don't act unless a defendant is inside that district and shows up to the court, Afrin said. However, there's nothing strictly prohibiting it either, and in a given instance, a plea could be taken internationally. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's not barred by any laws. If all parties consent to it, then the court has jurisdiction. That's if you want to accept the plea deal, right? Which we don't know what that is yet. right? Is it because what is it now? 185 years, something like that, right? You know,
My
what
God,
they
yeah.
drop it down to another 10, he could be dead in that time.
Yeah.
You know, like literally, he had a mini stroke. Like we're talking about, and Australian prisons aren't that much better than here, even if that was the case. Correct? So, on something he is not guilty of any crime. He's not. So,
Right. And notice how they haven't said what his crime was yet.
right.
Still
Yeah.
waiting.
Yeah, it's yes. So, Afrin said that 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy in London and 4 years in Belmarsh, Assange obviously would have a fear of coming to the US, and our prison system is often known for rough treatment in terms of management units and solitary confinement.
I
Afrin
mean,
said
y'all seen Oz.
yes. Yeah, not to be confused with our Oz. But Afrin said it was understandable that Assange would not trust the U.S. to follow through on a deal if he went to America. The U.S. sometimes finds ways to get around these agreements, Afrin said. The better approach would be that he pleads well in the UK, if at all. We resolve the sentence by either an additional sentence of 7 months, such as David Hicks had, or a year to be served in the UK or in Australia, or time served. Shipton told the Herald that his brother going to the U.S. was a non-starter. He said Julian cannot go to the U.S. under any circumstances. Afrin said Assange would not necessarily have to plead to an espionage or computer intrusion offense, which is one of the two things they are saying, right? Hacking or espionage, right? When he's not an American citizen.
Right.
That's what's happening, right? So he could plead simply to mishandling official information, or even, in the worst case scenario, conspiracy to mishandle conspiracy to mishandle official information. A far lesser charge.
I would argue conspiracy to mishandle official information wouldn't necessarily be a lesser charge to me. I just think they're making this up.
No, conspiracy is thinking about doing it.
Right,
in this case.
But official information, though, I would consider
like arguably
government.
Collin, it wasn't him that did that. It was the Washington Post. It was they did that. No, it was the Guardian.
That's what. But all I'm saying is, it just sounds like they're just trying to throw whatever
he didn't want to publish
charge
any of that stuff yet,
even though it doesn't make sense, and see what kind of sticks. That's what the impression this kind of gives me.
Yeah, I mean, and also espionage. That's bogus too. Pretty much.
Right.
They're accusing him of spying. For who? There has to be a reason for the spying. You have to spy for a country. Are you saying Australia used him as a spy? Are you saying Russia used him as a spy? That's what espionage
I'm sure that's
is.
what they're gonna.
Absolutely.
Sure that's what they're gonna go with.
Right. Which part of the plea deal would be like, I'm sure, give up your source and your funding and whatever. So that would also resolve the case and probably give the U.S. its satisfaction, and would allow Julian essentially to hold his head up high after all these years. I disagree to some degree.
No,
the fact that you have to claim any guilt when you weren't guilty at all, like
Assange is a lot more principled than that. Like, absolutely not.
The issue is, dude, he's been locked up in a hole for so long. He may take this just because it's a glimmer of hope to get out. So
I think this is why I want to think of it, and Missy can argue with this if I'm wrong. I think he would rather die. And I think that's the kind of stance we all should be taking.
I think he's
rather die in revealing the truth.
Bro, he's got 2 kids.
Living a life.
He's got 2 kids, a wife. Like, he might want to get back to them. Like, I'm just saying, like...
But here's the thing, and...
I don't wish he would, but I think it's a possibility.
Here's an aside, though. Very quick. I've had this conversation with my dad in terms of You know, like, I don't have the necessarily the best relationship with my dad. My dad is a Pan-Africanist, very much for the movement. And like, he separated from my mom when I was very young. And one thing that I remember him saying at one point was, in a sense, he felt like he had to make a choice between his family or the movement. And he chose the movement. Do I feel that's necessarily the best decision he could have made? I don't know, because it's ended up not having. I think back as a child, teenager, like, I didn't quite understand why he would not be for his family in the way that he should have, versus like what his feelings were regarding Black liberation. That being said, now as an adult, not to say I agree, but I understand why.
Yeah.
Because it's the idea of, what do you want to be known for when you're dead and gone? And I think the idea that Julian has in his mind is, and I don't want to say that he wants to die a martyr, but it's the idea of what he represented in terms of free press and the idea of being a martyr for the truth. That, I think, at the end of the day, if he's able, the sacrifice he'll have to make for his kids, I totally get. But I think, in my mind, that's the sacrifice that he's willing to make.
That's on top of the psychological torture involved, and that's only what we can see, let alone the stuff's happening behind the scenes. So, you know, I'm not going to be upset if he chooses this. I will understand why he would have. But
I think that's his decision. That's only a decision that he will have to make. But I would argue that, especially for his kids and Stella, you know, it's the idea of like, they will be able to kind of learn the truth and carry on that memory for their dad, in honor of their dad. And I think ultimately, to me, that will something that will last beyond him, which I think, to me, in my mind, that's a lot more powerful than him kind of taking a deal, in this case, just to be home. That's a hard choice. I don't think there's any right or wrong in this, honestly.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's a choice that Julian has to make. But as I said, given how I believe him to be somewhat principled, I believe that, obviously, we don't want him, you know, to die from this, obviously. But it's the idea, if you're willing to die for the betterment of the press, in terms of truth, in terms of exposing, that's what's going to carry. Because
the precedent,
people are not going to continue.
Yeah.
It's the president, you know, and people like us, and like, shout out to Misty. If anything, that's going to,
it could make things worse,
gain more momentum in terms of his advocacy.
Well, my issue with this is with, it's a half measure from these Australian legal teams, only because they're getting some public pressure from it to say that now we should have a plea deal. No, ask for him out.
But who's to say the advocacy now should be no?
Offer him asylum. Like, do something other than this. This is just accept it so we can move on. That's what this is.
Right. And I don't think, and it sounds like, you know, Gabriel, it doesn't sound like that they're not going to go for that, but that's where the advocacy should fall right now, is in terms of, let him go, or if you really want to mess with him, give him asylum.
Yeah.
You know?
So here's Bruce Afrin on Joe Lauria's and Kathy Vogan's show over at Consortium. And we're going to listen to him.
think the United States would consider offering such a plea deal, this Alford plea deal to Assange?
Well, the U.S. does offer plea deals in many instances, especially in cases that touch on espionage and international issues of this nature. Julian doesn't have to plead to an espionage offense or a computer hacking offense. He could plead simply to mishandling official information, or even in a worst case scenario, conspiracy to mishandle official information, a far lesser charge. And that would also resolve the case and probably give the U.S. its satisfaction and would allow Julian essentially to hold his head up high after all of these years.
Those charges are not in the original indictment, but you were saying to us before that the indictment could be amended to those charges.
It can be amended to include what we call a lesser included offense. This is often done in cases of this nature.
Kathy.
Now, Stephen Kenny said to me that he hoped the US wouldn't force Julian Assange to take a plea. But if so, he hoped they would never force him to come to the US. Would it be possible to do one without the other?
You know, Kathy, that's a very interesting question. Usually American courts don't act unless a defendant is inside their district and shows up to the court. However, there's nothing strictly prohibiting it either. And in a given instance, a plea could be taken internationally. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's not barred by any laws. If all parties consent to it, then the court has jurisdiction. And so I think that that is an option for Julian. I think that he's obviously in a troubled state of mind. He's gone through a horrendous experience, and first virtual incarceration in an embassy, then being dragged out of the embassy, incarcerated for nearly a year for a bail jumping offense for a crime that was dropped, and now incarcerated for more than 3 years pending extradition. And so, you know, he obviously would have a fear of coming to the US. And our prison system is often known for rough treatment in terms of management units and solitary confinement. And the US sometimes finds ways to get around these agreements. The better approach would be that he pleads while in the UK. We resolve the sentence by either an additional sentence of 7 months, such as David Hicks had, or a year to be served in the UK or in Australia, or time served. He's already served more than 3 years, which is probably what he would get anyway in a normal trial setting. So there are ways to do this if everyone wants to find a solution. That's a very important point. Also, by the way, he could plead guilty and make a reservation as to the constitutionality of the charge and still seek an appeal on that ground. That's really what happened in the Hicks case. In any event, there are ways to solve these problems if both sides want to.
Anything to add on that, Care Bear?
You did.
I mean, as I said, it's make this go away in the way that is the most expedient for the people involved other than Assange.
Yeah.
So it's tough because, as I said, if this is a way for him, and that's not even discussed, and that's the thing, it's like, will he be able to go home, or none of that is just basically more prison time. Basically, is what we're hearing right now. You know, so to me, it's just kind of like, how different is that going to be from where he is now? The only difference is he's going to be, if he is extradited here, you know, he's going to potentially going to be put where? Like, you know, the situation is going to be way worse for him.
Yeah.
Right.
So
he could get more like
the same black sites that they put people like Epstein in, that kind of stuff.
Right. Right. And I don't want to say stuff, you know, in terms of but, you know, some mess can happen.
Yeah.
Accidentally. And the
cameras might not work. And.
So
right. So the issue is right now is that he's in limbo, right? Legally, he's in Belmarsh. They haven't decided like actually grab him and bring him here. So, I mean, so on May 22nd, 2 days before President Joe Biden was due to visit Australia on a trip, he then canceled, right? Assange lawyer Jennifer Robinson said for the first time on behalf of the Assange legal team that they would consider a plea deal. Robinson told the National Press Club in Canberra, we are considering all options. The difficulty is our primary position is, of course, that the case ought to be dropped, which I would agree with. We say no crime has been committed and the facts of the case don't disclose a crime. So what is it that Julian would be pleading to? Assange remains in Belmarsh, awaiting a final 30-minute hearing before the High Court of England, Wales, which is on summer recess until October 1st. Okay, more limboing, right? Assange's lawyers will attempt to reverse a decision by the High Court not to hear his appeal against the Home Secretary's extradition order and against most of the lower courts ruling in his extradition case. That court, in January 21, ordered Assange released on health grounds in the conditions of U.S. prisons, but sided with the U.S. on every other point of law. The U.S. then won its appeal before the High Court, which overturned the order to release Assange. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is due to visit President Biden at the White House at the end of October, at which time Assange supporters may hope that an arrangement to send Assange to Australia could be finalized, but the High Court could convene before that. If it rejects Assange's final appeal, he could be put on a plane to Alexandria, Virginia, where he faces up to 175 years in a U.S. dungeon for publishing article information about U.S. war crimes and corruption.
Yo, Alexandria is just right across the river from me. If that happens, there's going to be enough people here that will fly into Virginia to protest against that.
Yeah.
So
2,000 years later.
Greg Barnes, a human rights
go
lawyer.
ahead and do it.
Right. Greg Barnes, a human rights lawyer who advises the Assange campaign. Colin's talking about getting a posse together with dynamite, and I'm down. A couple of lassos. It's going to be a great time. You can ride your old time horse, right? Told the Australian Associated Press that Assange had come between the U.S. and Australia as Washington gets Canberra's cooperation to set up new U.S. military facilities in Australia as it ramps up pressure on China. That's why this might even be happening. Right? That they're saying like, hey, if we're going to do your dirty work, you're going to have to like let us have this one.
Right.
So it's clearly a diplomatic issue because it has engaged the prime minister and the foreign minister. It's not an ordinary run-of-the-mill extradition case, Barnes said. This matter has become a sticking point in the alliance. So, yeah. He's not guilty. Drop the case. End of story. Anything else?
I'll let him go. Look, as I said, if I was in his shoes, I don't think in this case there's a right or wrong answer for him of what he should do. But I would argue, I like to believe that he is as principled as I've been told he is, and will not do it, even if that means his life. Because again, it's the precedent that it will be set. That speaks to other people who will want, like, that kind of puts other people, like journalists, in danger if he does. So who's to say they can't implicate like Ava Bartlett or
anybody? The precedent.
Anybody or us,
Then
or our audience, if they choose to go into citizen journalism, who's to say that can't happen to any one of us if that happens?
Look at the precedent here. Conspiracy to maluse government information. That was pretty much what it said, right? Like, the precedent of that, like if he pleads guilty to that, then what is that? They go after everyone with that.
Right.
And then you might
So,
get how long in prison? How long has he been there? That's then the precedent.
Right.
And possibly more if they then tack on espionage and whatever. Like, then it could just be, well, we definitely can get you for this, but we'll try to get you for the other stuff, you know? So, whistleblowing would stop. That would not be a thing. You would just ruin every whistleblower protection you have, which there really isn't any to begin with. So, anyway,